you that don't know me, I'm Carolyn Mountford, the CEO and Director of Research at the Translational Research Institute. Welcome to the TRI Forum, number 3 for the year, entitled The Dilemmas of Governance in Translational Trials. On behalf of the TRI, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Scott Bell, Senator of the CEDU, Sabine Cent, and a special welcome to the chair for the forum, Barbara Vieira, from the multi-regional clinical trials at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd like to just start off with a very short personal experience, which I think plays into this, and that is I personally, on my team did, had a 3-year wait in order to get governance to start a program here that had actually been proven clinically in another state in Australia. And that was preoperative diagnosis of ovarian lesions. When we finally got the ethics was quite fast, but when we finally got the governance approved, we were changing the way the patients were managed at the Mater Hospital from the first patient that we actually examined. And so I think a theme today, as we investigate the frustrations of many of you in the room for the time taken, we should be remembering that whilst we are scientists and clinicians and translators, at the end of the day, it's the patients that we are trying to help. And as we vocalise some of our frustrations today, for the time I've been back in Australia, I have actually attended many of the innovation translation symposia, think tanks around the country, once Alan Finkel became the chief scientist. And it became very clear to me that we here on this precinct are extremely fortunate because with the speed, the accuracy and the care that our ethical review is undertaken and given to us. So I think thanks should be given to Metro South for the capacity in which they operate. That is not the case around the rest of Australia, and their frustrations are very vocal, and they are held up considerably longer than we are from the time we actually want to translate and undertake a clinical trial. Our chair for today, Barbara Vieira, is a haematologist-oncologist. She's got a wealth of experience in medical innovation and clinical trials. She co-founded and now leads the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Centre at the Brigham and Harvard in a collaborative effort to improve standards for the planning and the conduct of international clinical trials with a particular focus on emerging economies. So before I sit down, I'd also like to particularly welcome Scott Bell, who is going to take over as the CEO of TRI in February next year. So this is your first opportunity to get to know Scott and to listen to him. So welcome Scott, welcome everybody, and I'll hand over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, and thank you for all being here. It's been a wonderful visit to TRI and to Queensland and to Australia. I feel like I spoke a lot yesterday, and I want to be respectful and stimulate discussion today. We have, are you going to speak again? No. So 3 speakers that have some prepared remarks, and then we're going to engage in sort of a discussion about some of the issues that we've all talked around or talked about, with the intent to see what the enthusiasm is for creating a path forward to harmonize and systematize trials so that they are more efficient, effective, and bring treatments to patients sooner.
So thanks very much, Barbara and Carolyn, for the welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about our personal experience as a lead of a research group. And our work sort of fits somewhere between clinical trials work and non-clinical work, and that's probably what most people in the clinical space do, and that's clinical research. And there are some particular challenges in the approval process, and I'll perhaps show some salutary lessons, but also potentially a way forward. Importantly, I think it is now well recognised that one can get approval, research approval, to undertake a multi-centre study that's firstly manned quicker than you can doing a non-interventional clinical observational research project involving multiple jurisdictions and multiple sites. So it's a little bit ambiguous as to how this works. These are my disclosures and funding bodies. This has been an active space. These are publications in local journals over the past 3 or 4 years. We obviously know Adrian Barnett and Nick Graves' work in this space out of OSHI and QUT, but there are many others that have really addressed the issues around getting research approvals, which includes both the ethics and the site-specific governance approval. And I'll highlight the work by Holly Foote and Ian Scott's group out of Metro South, which really addresses the issue around some of the frustrations in undertaking what traditionally would be classed relatively low-risk research, and yet we are really struggling at getting approvals. This is some work for, some snippets from a publication published from Geoffrey Braithwaite's group last year, and I just want to highlight a few comments. There's not much knowledge about the processes for non-clinical trials within state and hospital governance organisation, and there's variation of opinion as to whether such is low or high risk when it comes to research. The states and territories of Australia have widely differing site-specific assessment requirements, and many hospitals demanded a local research agreement to commence prior to any of the research being undertaken. And many of you would think that's very reasonable. Site-specific assessment forms frequently have additional jurisdictional and local requirements. Just go to the Victorian system and they have a whole raft of additional paperwork that's in addition to all of the paperwork that we might fill out locally. And of course then there's the whole issue of the Public Health Act in Queensland and similar jurisdictional legislation pieces across the country, which mean that even to get access to clinical data of patients that we are providing care for can provide a lot of roadblocks in getting research approval. Now, bearing in mind that this, so Geoffrey Braithwaite's group actually published a suggestion for policymakers through to researchers as to how we might be able to have a framework for non-clinical research. And I'm not going to go into the details here, you can find the paper quite easily, but really the suggestion has been for large multi-centre non-clinical studies we should be simplifying the process, and that's really the take-home message from this and the previous slide. So where are we? And this is our personal experience. So in the late 2000s we received funding from our National Health and Medical Research Council to undertake a project looking at the most common bacterial pathogen in people with cystic fibrosis, really leveraging off clinical care. So what we wanted to do was collect samples, which were really waste products within our clinical laboratories, and then link that with clinical data and do some molecular genetics on the bacteria that were identified. We had 16 clinical sites. We also had a myriad of clinical laboratories which had their own approval processes, and to say nothing of the research institutes and universities we had to deal with. Now that whole process was really in the pre-site specific approval era. We've only had that for just over 10 years. And the process took us, with a highly competent research officer, 24 months. It cost us 10% of our budget, and it actually utilised real paper, 13,000 pieces of paper. And we published that work, and we really highlighted the issues at the time of the HOMA project to harmonise ethics approval across the country was being implemented. So 10 years later, we've moved on to another bacteria in people with cystic fibrosis, this time non-tuberculous mycobacteria. And as you can see, we had learned, and in fact one of our close collaborators and co-chief investigators, Claire Wainwright from the Children's Hospital in Brisbane, said, you better get moving on your ethics approval. So within 2 weeks, even before we got official notification from NH and MRC, we met with a research governance officer, highly experienced within health in Queensland, and we also worked with the QIMR ethics and governance team, as well as the grants and legal teams, to sit down and just try and figure out how this would work. So we were really quite proactive. We got the ethics approved incredibly quickly, and I'll show you the data shortly, and mostly through mutual acceptance through a single ethics committee based at the Queensland Children's Hospital. At that stage, Tasmania and Western Australia were still on the journey, as was South Australia, who now have been incorporated into the national ethics approval process. So the time taken was pretty much the same, and what filled the space, even though we made huge gains in the ethics side of things, was how long it took to get the government's approvals at each of the sites. And most of that was around the negotiation of the research agreements. Now, many of the research governance officers around the country said, why don't you use a Medicines Australia clinical trials agreement? We would love to have done that. However, the research institutes, including our own research institute, refused to do that. They wanted to use their own agreement. And so that's where we came to a roadblock. If you have a clinical trial, even a first in man, you can roll out a clinical research agreement, a Medicines Australia one, and actually negotiate very quickly, whereas if you've got a low-risk clinical trial, which is leveraging off data that you're collecting and samples you're collecting for clinical purposes, it's much more difficult. So what we're really missing is a parallel piece to what we have for the Medicines Australia Clinical Trials Agreement for non-interventional clinical research across sites and across the states and territories. Interestingly, in very recent times, the registries across the country have got together and have now amended their own clinical trials agreements for registries, which have worked with the Queensland, New South Wales and Victorian governments, and they've been pre-approved. And that's certainly a step in the right direction. We definitely need something like this for our governance processes when you're undertaking low-risk research. So we very recently published our work. This is online in the Internal Medicine Journal. I just want to take you through a few steps here. As you can see, we've got the ethics approval here and the governance. And we had to apply to 4 jurisdictions for ethics approval, but most sites were actually covered by the Queensland Children's Hospital. The number of documents was still quite significant, and the median days from submission to approval was a month, and I think everyone would agree that that's reasonably good. The longer, the outlier here was Tasmania, which actually is a bit of an anachronism in that they work through the University of Tasmania rather than through an ethics committee within health. However, we had to undertake many governance applications. We had lots of documents. It took a long time to get signatures, and that's particularly problematic when you need to get wet signatures undertaken at peripheral sites, led by busy clinicians trying to get business managers and local executive directors sign off. And consequently, the time to approval was very significant. On the left here, you can see you can see the sites and you can see the ethics committees. Really, the ethics did okay, much better than we had 10 years previously. But as you can see here, we had major blowouts in negotiating the site-specific approval, which was very heterogeneous, and you can see that some of it was the external site, but QIMR wasn't an innocent party in this in terms of how they wanted to negotiate. So what's the take-home message? We need a cross-jurisdictional clinical research agreement framework for non-trial clinical research. And we need everyone that's negotiating that to consider what is the real risk for patients and what's the risk in not actually addressing the question in a timely fashion to our patients. And then also, can we have a sensible conversation about the likely IP that's going to be generated from this sort of work? What have we done so far? We have engaged with Ann Kelso, the CEO of NHMRC. NHMRC led the HOMA program for harmonising ethics approvals, and we're working through the Queensland NHMRC Council members at the moment, and we're also working, John Upham and I are working with Hero in Queensland Health to try and get some sensible conversations at a national level so we can perhaps replicate what's been done in ethics from a governance perspective. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandro Puccetto. I'm a radiation oncologist, and I am a full-time clinician who does some research. And this morning I'm going to give you a perspective from a clinician who tries to navigate through the administrative burden of conducting clinical trials. The take-home message right at the start is that ethics is okay, governance and research agreements are brutal. And so I want to walk you through that. Now, you're all of you here are pretty savvy in terms of research, but I thought it's worth just beginning by reminding us all what a clinician brings to translational research. So importantly, clinicians make clinical observations, and so we're able to identify those areas of need or potential improvement, the so-called bed to bench. The clinician is also usually a custodian of databases which identify patterns of care and outcomes, and therefore if you're bringing something to the clinic, we're able to compare the outcomes or use our databases as a benchmark for that intervention, the so-called bench to bed. The other thing is we are able to identify the clinical value or the potential role of a new discovery, either a first in human or in commercial terms. We're able to place a product in the market. And the most important thing is that we have the economy of patients. We are able to deliver the new IP or the product to patients. And we have a strong engagement with patients and a strong affiliation, and therefore we're more likely to be successful in accruing to trials. Now, as clinicians, we want to participate in research because we know that research will help amplify our clinical impact beyond just simply the face-to-face clinical interaction that you had, and you can do this through research output and publications. Not all clinicians wish to be researchers, but those that are, we should really champion them and provide the resources to help facilitate the process. Why? Because full-time clinicians are extremely time poor. We have clinical commitments, teaching commitments, administrative commitments. These are in fact our day job. Research has to be slotted somewhere in that. You know, as we say, 99% of my work is clinical and 50 to 60% of it is research. So we need to create enablers to help the process for clinicians. Now, I want to just really take you through the various levels of clinical research that clinicians are involved with, and then talk a little bit more about where we should focus our energy. So, industry-sponsored trials from a clinician point of view are relatively simple in that the administrative burden is taken care of by somebody else. We predominantly contribute to patient accrual and data collection, and if you happen to be on the steering committee of the sort of, say, industry-sponsored trial, you may get acknowledgement in the publication. Collaborative group-sponsored trials, such as, say, the Trans-Tasman Radiation Oncology Group or these sorts of collaborative trial groups, they provide us with also greater support of administrative. They help support administrative, contribution. They help us with the various resources that we need to conduct a trial. In collaborative trial group studies, we may get greater acknowledgement, usually because many of the investigators form part of the trial management committee group. And then we go to the non-collaborative group investigator-led clinical trials. Now these are much more burdensome from a clinician's point of view. We have to design the trial, we have to acquire the funding. There's a much greater administrative burden because we have to navigate the process, we have to accrue to the trial, but the reward is much greater. You have a higher level of acknowledgement in terms of publications, etc. Now this is the area that I'd like to just focus on this morning, because the other two, from a clinician point of view, is less burdensome from an administration point of view. So in the clinical world, you've got your retrospective studies or your quality audits. These are low-risk studies, minimal burden and minimal clinical impact. And then you've got your prospective databases or some sort of study where there is some intervention and you're collecting the data on that. Here the burden of administration starts to increase. The outcomes might be hypothesis generating, leading to other trials, or they may in fact have practice-defining roles, and here I've written moderate clinical impact. For example, you may do a study that is included into guidelines. But the tough one is this one, the investigator-led novel interventional clinical trial, where you may have developed a trial within, say, Metro South. It may be a single institution style site where you may be collaborating with one or two other bodies. It could be the university, it could be pharma. That's not too tough. But when you start to roll that into the multi-centre, multi-organisation, you've got a bio company, pharma, university, Metro South, then that starts to get incredibly challenging in terms of trying to bring everyone together, sign off on agreements, who's going to own the IP. Now, most of the clinician research is in those first two. Why? Because they don't represent such a big burden and because we're busy. But the value, I believe, is in this other one, in terms of, not that the other two are of no value, but here these are the ones that have much greater clinical impact in terms of practice-changing research. So what I want to do now is really just, if this is what you want to do, this is the process that you need to go through, and normally you don't have the support of a large collaborative trial group, you don't have the support of pharma, you don't have the support of industry. So you've got to do it all yourself. You have to assemble a team of investigators, you have to design the protocol and write it up, which these days is over 100 pages. You have to develop the database and the CRFs, you have to submit an application for the interventional agent to the holders of the IP or the agent. In this case, for example, you may need to apply to the global team of a drug company for a specific novel agent. You design the patient information and consent form, and you have to prepare a budget. And just as a reminder, these are skill sets that actually clinicians have to acquire. We don't learn this as part of our training. These are skill sets that you acquire on the job. And then, if you get through that hurdle, you've got to deal with these aspects: trial sponsor, contract and agreements, ethical clearance, governance and funding. Now, each of these requires its own sort of forms, and if it were a sequential process, that would be terrific, because you could just go from one step to the next step. But I'm going to show you in a moment that that doesn't actually work. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this Parkinsons Law. Parkinsons Law is the adage that work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. And this also applies in large bureaucratic systems, that the bureaucracy keeps getting bigger and bigger. So if you set up a new department, a new structure, that structure is going to make itself bigger and bigger. Where does the burden fall? It falls back on the people that need to fill the forms. So, now if you've got, as you work through this process, you then have to deal with the ethics committee, and here I've listed them. You have to obviously complete the application form for ethics. You have to complete the checklist, attach all the documents, including the protocol, the consent form, any documents that are given to the patient, such as diaries, investigator brochures, indemnity cover. You've got to confirm submission and meeting dates and submit appropriately. In addition, you then move to governance. So here you've got the research contracts approval form that needs to be completed and signed by the PI, department head and finance manager. And Scott's already alluded to the difficulties in getting all that signed. Now, if you've got, say, a study that involves radiology, pharmacy and medical oncology, multiply that by all the signatures of the department heads and finance managers for each department, you are doing a lot of chasing of signatures, and of course someone's on annual leave and so forth. So that burden sort of keeps multiplying every time you bring a new organisation to the trial. And then I won't go through the rest, but the site-specific documents are obviously very challenging. And of course, you are honoured by having to pay a fee to submit to governance. So the burden of clinical research is quite tough for a full-time clinician. There's no disputing the importance of ethics and governance. But what we really need is to be able to try and provide enablers to help remove some of these roadblocks and facilitate the process. So just to conclude, so here is the things you need to do once you've got your protocol, your team, etc. But the reality is that you often reach roadblocks as you start to approach these various aspects. You know, the sponsor doesn't want to know things until the contracts and agreements have been sort of signed. There's this sort of constant interplay that every time you go to the next step, they won't let you go forward until some other thing is done by another department. So to conclude, what would be nice, for example, is something simple like this. So say for an investigator-led novel interventional clinical trial, for the area that I'm referring to, the investigator-led where there isn't support from pharma, there isn't support from collaborative trial group, for Metro South to provide a trial navigator. So you've got your protocol, you've got your ethics clearance, and then a trial navigator kicks in to help you work through the process. And why can't these departments provide you with a provisional approval? Let's call it the PA approval, or PA, whereby ethics or governance might say, okay, we'll look at it now rather than wait till you've got everything together and everything is exactly ticked off, but rather complete as much as you can, have them hold it in a sort of a provisional approval for then completion to be signed off once you've got those missing bits, rather than meeting a roadblock which just continues to delay the process as you work through and you've got the holds up at all these various time points. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Sabine Cent. I'm a Research Partnerships Manager at the Faculty of Medicine, University of Queensland. I was asked to talk today because I am one of the administrative staff or professional staff who are at the front line when it comes to engaging in the processes and in particular setting up research agreements for collaborations. So my background is predominantly legal, but over time I've specialised in working for the Faculty of Medicine for their contracts, and now I'm on the other side, on the commercial side, helping to facilitate the process once we get the legal advice. So when I was asked to speak today, I was asked to consider some of the challenges that researchers face in establishing their contracts as a part of the governance process, and then to suggest how these solutions can be overcome. Some of my solutions are a little more practical than big picture, but at the same time, I would hope that they could lead to larger solutions down the track. In terms of the challenges, the delays to establishment, so Sandra has already talked at length about these, and I acknowledge they are there. They're there for both sides, both on the hospital administration and clinician side, as well as the university side. From the university perspective, we rely heavily on the site ethics approval, and as well as the governance approval in terms of establishing a research project. UQ ethics process is to ratify these site approvals as the lead approval, which again can take time because we are dependent on obtaining the lead ethics approval first. We do also have the issue of contract negotiations, and Scott raised the comment in regards to IP ownership, which continues to be a contentious issue. In some ways, I think it is because we are dealing with head-level agreements which have a blanket position when it comes to IP, and then you have to consider it on a case-by-case basis. So what may be appropriate for some collaborative projects is not always the same for others, and it also, to some degree, just depends on the institutional culture and what their policy is regarding ownership and benefits surrounding IP. As part of working through that process, you also have to take into account the different processes that each institution has, and again, Sandra has raised this in terms of what document do you have to put in at what time, who has to sign off on your form. So not only do you have to go through a sign-off process at the hospital, you have a duplicate but different process at the university. So you'll have to go through your head of school or head of centre to sign off on a series of forms regarding establishment of your project. We do try to work in tandem or at the same time as your ethics and governance approval process, but again, where you are dealing with administrators who may not be from a clinical or a research background, you're going to have issues in terms of their expertise and their ability to assess these applications. Which brings us on to the risk assessment element. One of the sort of key frustrations that was put forward to me, and I've seen it, is how do you assess the risk profile of a project? For clinicians, the risk in the research that you are doing, particularly a standard of care, is relatively low in your daily business. But at the university, where again, the people assessing the applications may not be clinicians, it's perceived as a high risk, because you're talking about people, you're talking about possible damage to people as a result of an untested product, and it may be a risk so low as, well, not low, but it may be a psychological risk as opposed to a physical risk. And at the end of the day, the university has to have insurance sufficient to cover that risk. And so, in some ways, the university has a different risk profile as to what is acceptable when it comes to the conduct of a trial, as opposed to a hospital. So, in my legal background, I've also worked at Queensland Children's Hospital, just briefly. And my one observation from being in that role was that at the university, researchers often think their project is about life and death. But when you're working in the hospital, in the sort of frontline delivery of care to patients, you really are dealing with life and death. And so if you set up those different levels of risk and the risk appetite, as it were, to me that highlights one of the biggest hurdles that we have to face in research when it comes to engaging with these issues of what is acceptable risk for one corporate institution as opposed to the other. Then there's the other issue of who is best placed to assess this risk. Institutions will say it's the person doing the project, that is the researcher. However, if you as a researcher or a clinician are not from a background where you've had to regularly engage in the exercise of conducting a risk assessment, and it is a very specific area of expertise these days, compliance and risk, it's a daunting prospect, because again, you're coming up against the issues of corporate culture and policy as to what is an acceptable level of risk. And you are being asked to stand up and say, yes, it's acceptable, no, it's not, which then triggers a chain of events such as, confirming our insurance coverage is appropriate, and so on. And it also goes then towards other clauses in the contract about risk, indemnity and liability. Are they appropriate? And so part of this all happens in the background to a certain degree when you are negotiating the contracts, but it is something that is taken into account, and the consideration of such does cause delays in establishing the contract. Then we come to the issue of resourcing. So the university is set up from a central administration unit as well as local administration units that work for various faculties and institutes. And the way the university operates is that some of the money is used to fund central services and some are used to fund faculty services. A role such as mine is often a co-funded role from both central and faculty. But the budget is limited. And when you have a limited budget in terms of resourcing bodies on the ground or people answering emails or dealing with projects, you're going to have workload issues, which leads to turnaround times. So this is another part of the delay. So you may send an email, for example, to me or to your governance officer. It may take me 1 or 2 weeks to respond to you due to the sheer volume of the work that's on. After a couple of weeks, I come back to you and I say, I need to know X, Y, and Z. Can you please send me a copy of your protocol? Do you have your ethics approval yet? And a series of other questions that, from the university perspective, we need to know before we can sign a contract. So then it takes you a couple of weeks, and it may take even longer because sometimes you may not have this information to hand yet. So as Sandro's chart showed, the process tends to happen in a kind of organic amoeba type way as opposed to a very systematic one. I think part of that is our response so that matters don't sit until one step in the process is done. But at the same time it can lead to blockages and delays. And so then by the time you come back to me, I prepare a draft contract, I send it to the other side for review. And then they have to go through the process. And they will contact their researchers to say, is this correct? Do you have a copy of X, Y, and Z? And then again, depending on the timing, they may take between 2 and 6 weeks to come back to me. So already we're at about 3 to 6 months where we're looking at being in a position where we can sign a contract. And that's assuming we're working off a template that doesn't need any changes. In some cases, you have changes to a template, such as special conditions to the clinical trial agreements, or you may have a very specific agreement that one institution wants to use as opposed to another. And often legal agreements put out by one side are favourable to that side. They're not necessarily favourable to the other side. So then you engage in a contract negotiation process where you get your lawyers involved, and so back and forth it goes, or it's wry smiles in the front row and nodding of heads. So not to make light of it, but really to explain that the delays aren't there because of people being difficult. It's about people, particularly at my level of middle management or middle administration, having to do the job that they're required to do as part of policy, procedure, process. Then, briefly, portfolio coverage for absences, again, goes back to the issue of budget and resourcing. So I'm fortunate the Faculty of Medicine has resourced a team of RPMs. We're all very busy, but it means that at least we have someone with knowledge to cover when someone goes on leave or we have an unexpected absence. We have an ability to move work between us to help out with capacity. However, some governance officers and contract managers may not have that. They may be the only person. And so if they go on leave, it's correct, the work will sit for 2 weeks. Because sometimes it is just simply more efficient from an institutional perspective to hold the work rather than trying to bring someone else up to speed. Because what someone can do in half an hour because they know the background may take someone a whole day to figure out. So there's also that issue. In terms of the response, to these challenges, this is from my perspective, again, at middle administration, as someone who is on the front line trying to get these contracts across the line as quickly as possible. I do feel that clinicians and researchers, although time poor, acknowledge, at the same time, there is a lot of information available on the websites of institutions, and there are people such as myself in the governance office who are very happy to help, to talk you through the process and to provide all the information we can. But sometimes that information really does have to come from the clinician researcher because nobody knows your project like you know your project. And if you do not have a project manager, then again, it is you. And that is partly because we are not from a clinical or research background, and also because this is one of 50 to 100 matters that is coming across our desk on a regular basis. So we're not project managers, we're more facilitators. So if you can provide all the information that is requested at the time it is required, that will cut down on the need for people such as myself to go back and forth and say, well, I need this document, I need this document. So in other words, don't drip feed. If there is a checklist on the website that says, please provide this information, that is what you need to provide at the time of application to get review done as quickly as possible. I acknowledge there's a lot of detail that is required, but as Sandra also said, it's an important process, the ethics and governance review process, because otherwise, if those reviews don't happen, things go wrong. I guess it really talks to the next point as well. If you're asked for more information, please provide it. I once had a contract delayed for several weeks because a researcher was asked to confirm whether data would be going to a third party, patient data, de-identified patient data would be going to a third party or not, and they simply refused to confirm it. And so the whole matter sat until we had a further conversation where I said, we just need to know, are you sending this data to X, Y, and Z, or will it remain in Queensland, or where is it going? At that point, we got an answer that was sufficient, and we could move on. So it's really dealing with these kind of issues that adds unnecessary delay. In terms of risk assessment, again, engage early, follow the procedures of your institutions, and use the tools that are provided to you when preparing those documents. And when it comes to resourcing, you need to have a realistic expectation of timing and resource your trial appropriately. And that means factor in potential delays for establishing a contract and getting a governance and ethics approval. Although ideally, most of these things will happen within a couple of months, you should at least factor in a contingency plan for 3 to 6 months if your project is a little more complicated. And then when it comes to resourcing, consider the admin and project support that you will need and build this into your budget at the time of application. I just have one more slide there about the actual specifics of what's required to establish a clinical trial at UQ. And it's very specific to UQ requirements. I won't go through it now. No, it's fine. What I was going to say is I'm happy to circulate this after the presentation and take questions as well. Just in finishing, I was going to say, Barbara asked me yesterday about some big picture solutions. And although I don't have a slide on it, I just wanted to say, I agree with Scott's suggestion that we should have a national template. I would actually go further and say we should just use an international template. The Medicines Australia templates are based on European EU templates. So I say, why stop at national? Let's go worldwide. Let's just cut to the chase. Institutions need to put aside their differences and focus on the common good. And that is about, in some cases, you may need to concede on a hardline policy position when it comes to IP ownership, as opposed to the other benefits that you can get from where you concede on some of these points. And I would also say that the administration roles that actually are there at the coalface helping get the contracts done and the ethics approval should be resourced appropriately. This means good training. It means support from management that empowers them to make decisions when they're on the front line, as opposed to having to refer back to corporate and legal for further advice. And finally, whatever is decided, everybody has to own the problem and the solution. Because if we can't get a common agreement, then we can set up all the documents and processes we want. But if not everybody owns that outcome, they will not be useful.
Thank you. Let me just say, in listening to this, it sounds like there are a few different levels of challenges. There's one which is quite sort of technical, administrative, which seems like a good process mapping of the various efforts that are done at the different hospitals, comparing them, and then figuring out what pieces align and what pieces don't would be pretty useful. And, you know, sort of the common forms, and even these site assessments, you know, as you've been talking about them, every site assessment is a little different. And every, you know, sort of finance decision and form is a little different. You're basically asking the same information. You could collect those all, do the, whatever it's called, the least common multiple, and just have one form. Save enormous amounts of time for you all. So there's a whole set of sort of technical questions. Then we get to sort of institutional issues, which we really want to spend a little time on. One, why are people risk adverse? And we'll talk about that. And, you know, and the financial sort of accounting of all of this. And then the third level is the inter-institutional collaboration. And is there a commitment to really do this across, you know, Brisbane and Queensland and beyond? Or really, are we microcosms a little bit competitive with one another? So let me start, I mean, I'm sure there are many other issues. Let me start with one question. Has there ever been a bad, you know, sort of press about a clinical trial here? Have you ever really had, you know, a bad experience in this?
Perhaps I could, I'm not entirely sure, but there is an organisation here called Clinical Oncology Society of Australia, COSA, and COSA provides an umbrella insurance for most of the collaborative trial groups in Australia. There has never been a suit against someone enrolled on a clinical trial under that umbrella group. So there was one complaint, but no successful suit
No
ever.
suits. And what about reputational risk? Have ever been on the front page of the local daily? The what? Courier Mail?
So we have the Courier Mail test. I think I told you.
Yeah, but
It's
I
our
mean,
local
you know, that's a theoretical risk. Have you ever had, you know, the front page sort of problem?
There are others in the audience that could answer.
Anybody?
So I don't recall it.
So, yes.
We've had ethical issues that have gone on the front page of the Courier Mail, but I don't think we've had a cooperative clinical trial that has ever gone onto the front page of the
So
Courier.
the ethical issue was not a clinical trial?
No,
Oh, it was.
things like falsification, there's actually been a whole number of them, but falsification of data is the...
Yeah, but I'm talking about clinical trials. Yeah.
I think when you think about reputational risk, it's not just the reputational risk of something bad going on with the clinical trial, but the flip side is the reputational risk. If the Courier Mail decided to run an article that said 20% of research budgets is wasted on unnecessary paperwork and administration, and these academic institutions and hospitals can't get their act together and act in a timely fashion, that's actually a reputational risk on the other side.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm asking, you know, we've got a whole body, we've heard about from 3 or maybe 4 people, this hesitancy to approve a trial. It's not based on ethics, because that's got an ethics review. It's not based on risk, because you're having as much trouble with the pretty low-level risk, other than informational and dignity risk, you know, as with first-in-man trials. And yet these things are being held up for months. So what's the risk? Yeah.
I think certainly a major contributor to that is the fact that it's bits and pieces of people doing bits and pieces of the work. In terms of gathering all the information, having that fundamental training and support delivered to the governments and administrators, because that's a key area that I see as a massive hole that's contributing to all this mess.
To the delays.
So again, if I could reiterate from the clinicians are not lawyers, they're not
Yeah,
administrators.
we know what you do.
The point is to navigate through, I kind of referred to the skill set that we have to deal with, which we're not necessarily, have.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, good. Carolyn?
So, can I just put an academic scientist perspective here, because those of us that aren't active clinicians, we don't have the basis on which you design your trials, okay? So we come in without that prior knowledge. We know on this campus there's probably something like 400 clinical trials already underway. So TRI created translational trials capability to actually help the scientists and the clinician scientists that don't have this sort of background. So we actually have a team of people that are very well equipped to tell us what we need to provide, help us to provide that, and actually walk the way through. And I think that's very important in order for genuinely clinically applicable innovations to actually get through the translational process and pop out the other end. So our requirements are quite different to the clinicians.
So can I ask, could Sandro give you at TRI his complex investigator-led clinical trial, and your team could manage it through the process at MetroSouth?
Yes, there'd be some cost, not a lot, but there would be some cost, and we could absolutely do that.
And if they absolutely couldn't afford it, would you have a mechanism to say, okay, this is really critically important, we need to do it?
Yeah, we do, but that'll be his problem next year, not mine.
I get it. I mean, a lot of the problems are probably solvable, except for the political will.
So, can I add something about risk? And this is purely from the bottom of the heap, poor scientist point of view, and I completely agree with everything Sandra said. You get to forums where they say, we can't do that until you've got that, and you go to the person and say, well, you can't do that until you've got that, so you end up in circles. So they had a really good idea, which was called these BDHP passports, which were agreements that we would have between the groups in science and the groups at MetroSouth Health. And initially it worked great, but here's the risk. So the scientists aren't clinicians, we don't have salaries, we get paid on a yearly basis when we find our own salary to pay ourselves, and we get grants.
You're a good company, by the way.
And it's really hard to get those grants. So now, for instance, you guys know me, I work with Ben Panizza. I've had to fill out 7 different PDHPs with Ben Panizza for each different set of money we've got, in some cases $20,000 grants. It takes 6 months to go through. I have a year to produce the data and keep my job. So the problem we have is now we're getting the grants, and we used to get the grant, spend the money, do the research. Now we get the grant, it takes 6 months for them to raise a GRL, where we have to have everything in place first. And at the end of the year, we have to report. So I would say the risk of not streamlining the process is IP, which everybody needs to understand and people don't. IP is not the data you generate. When you patent something, you have to prove it's an original idea that nobody else has had. The money is in the splits, and that's debated later.
Yeah.
And so if people actually understood what IP was and just put their agreements into the splits, and we actually got to do the research, because the risk you have is that the people feeding the IP to the hospital and the patients aren't going to be here anymore, because the bureaucracy takes so long they can't produce the results, and we all leave science.
Yes.
So I just make a comment. Sabine talked about the issue of making sure that your budget includes sufficient administrative support. Our experience with our second grant that I talked about was we learned from the first one and we put in sufficient administrative support, but we got heavily criticised, probably got very close to not getting the grant because we had too much buffer in there. Now we defended that and we were successful with the grant, but I don't know that the grant awarding bodies fully appreciate the challenges around that part of the administrative component for doing research, which really speaks to what the last question was about.
Just to say, the way we've solved it is by having an administrative coordinator. And it's not based on 10% of, X person. It's based on the same way that an IRB fee gets put onto the grant, that whatever your fee is, at $1,500, $2,500, whatever that is, you can put that in if it's an institutional policy. I mean, just as an idea. I mean, all of these things I think are solvable if there's will. And part of the question is who is in a position at these institutions to make those changes. So, yes?
I've got a different topic, sorry. About 12 years ago, we set up to do a clinical trial in patients with prostate cancer, which was a first in-man trial. And one of the first things we did was to go to the TGA and obtain their approval, and nobody's mentioned that. And I wondered if the university would be less risk averse to a procedure which had already got permission to go ahead through the TGA.
Do you know?
I can't speak 100%.
Maybe go on. Maybe we can just
Eat it.
I feel like a drumstick, isn't it? I don't actually know that would make the university less risk averse. Obtaining the CTN is a certification to the university that it is a clinical trial to be run by certain standards. However, some of the issues that the university faces is that just because a project will have a CTN, the researchers running it as a clinical trial may not have the background or experience, or they need to ask the questions, do you have the background and experience? So it is more of a process. I was going to say, Chris, if I can put you on the spot. So Chris is the governance director from UQ who is responsible for establishing the CTNs as part of our review process. Chris, could I ask you to speak to whether having a CTN is seen as less risky for the university or not?
I think the reality is we have researchers doing investigator-initiated trials without any understanding of GCP, and those are the issues really are fundamental. Sorry.
They're the fundamental issues for us. It's not really the risk aversion of the university, it's the capacity of investigators to do the research.
Yeah, can I just ask, how do you evaluate that? Do you know your researchers well enough to know the GCP training and whether they've got them? And if that's the case, why not train them?
Absolutely, totally agree. And that's our fundamental issue at the university currently, is putting benchmarks in place.
So historically,
my mouth is open. Okay, that's fixable, right?
Yes, and so now that the hospitals have actually made it, is it all HHSs that have made it mandatory to have GCP training?
Most of us have GCP.
So the big problem is the investigator-initiated study, clinical trials. It isn't mandatory at the moment, although it is in Victoria, and it is in Metro North as of this year. If you're the site PI, you must provide your GCP certification. You can get that from all sorts of different sources, not just face-to-face training, which we have, but also from online training. So I think this is going to be a move across the country now. And if you're a site PI, you must demonstrate that. We've done that very well because we're forced to, because you won't get drug into pharmacy for clinical trials from sponsored studies. But what we haven't done nationally is do that for the investigator-initiated studies as well.
So interesting, but it does seem to me that that's you don't have to wait for the nation to do it. You can do that institutionally. And then would that relieve you if you could see that they had been GCP trained?
The issues really aren't risk. We just have to ensure that our insurers are satisfied with the trials. And we have 3 criteria now for insurance. Children under 5, women who are pregnant, and first in human trials. They're the only categories where we may hold up research to get insurance review.
Do you get insurance review for each trial that
No.
involves those 3?
Only those 3. So we are actually quite quick to turn around trials. The real issues are the contracts and researchers understanding what they're contributing to each component of the research. So for us, we might have 3 or 4 different parties involved in a trial, and we need to understand which party is doing what. And that's where the dilemmas come in.
And your insurer, do they charge you extra for these trials?
They may do, depending on their call. So far, we haven't received any requirements. We just have to notify and wait for acceptance.
I see. That's also something that you could work out with them,
Absolutely.
right? That you notify them, and if you don't hear in 5 days, it's approved. If they've never done it before. I mean, some of this is just breaking down the fact that these are unlikely events that people are worried about. I get the part that they're worried, but getting the research done is also an ethical mandate for places that are resourced and as excellent as you are.
I'll make another point about this.
Can you use the mic?
So I just want to make another point about risk, and one of them is that when you deal with pharma, they usually want a quick turnaround if they're going to provide you, say, free of charge or in kind, a drug. And one of the risks is that the whole process takes too long, and it's not uncommon for some studies to have actually taken 2 years to get governance. The company will withdraw their drug, and we have one on the table at the moment where the company's given us $2 million worth of immunotherapy drug for a trial. We've already surpassed the deadline once, they've given us one more extension. But the risk here is just not getting through the process fast enough. We actually lose a significant investment by a company to provide us with a novel drug which will, at the end of the day, it's the patient who's going to miss out on the potential of this therapy.
So one question is whether there is sort of the political will to say we want an answer in 14 days. If you don't have an answer, we want to hear about it. Which comes from the top, not from the bottom. You have 14 days to give us an answer, prove, and if you disapprove, you need to say why, or push it up the chain. Would that work?
Yeah, it will work, and I think the Australian Medical Research Institutes, most of whom are independent, they actually have the capacity to make that decision from the top and ensure the appropriate personnel are actually in place, okay? But at the end of the day, they can provide the resources to undertake the tasks, but they are still limited by a response from the hospital or the respective area health to respond, because it's their patients, okay? So at the end of the day, the rate determining step is going to come from the hospitals.
Yeah. No, you're on.
I've got 2 questions. First of all, I'm new to Australian research, but I've got lots of research within Europe. I'm just wondering, has anyone actually done a gap analysis of what the problems are, what the rate limiting steps are in governance here? We're saying is that do we actually have the metrics on that?
So
that's number one.
Scott?
Sonia,
We, a couple of years ago, we participated in the NHRC pilot for we participated in a trial for piloting a new governance process. To say the least, it's a wicked problem in that it's so multifactorial that unless it comes back down to resources again, because if you don't have the appropriately trained people in place to actually dissect and look at it, it's flawed right at the start. We have one research governance officer who looks after between 15 to 20 new submissions every week. Now, to get through all of those is a feat in itself, but to actually take a step back and look at where the problems are would mean that person or someone else would have to go offline
for a good month. We
Yeah.
can't. Our resources would be screaming at us.
But you can bring something new in.
We
Yeah,
absolutely
do
do.
to look at what the problems
And-
are,
yeah.
to universal aspect in all the institutions, and to look at the commonalities and do the problem
I
solving.
think we have sort of started to initiate the process through BHP research partnerships. But however, that is what you were saying, Barbara, before about the that silo effect. It doesn't include all of the partners around the southeast corner. So I think that's limiting in itself. I think we need to broaden our view and actually look at the state in its entirety, not just one corner.
So it sounds like you think BPHP, or whatever the acronym is, the right body to at least initiate some of this analysis.
Definitely, but I don't think it's just up to BDHP. I think it's a co-design effort in terms of engaging with the Department of Health, BDHP, all of the academic partners, all of the health service who are involved in clinical trials. Because give it another year and a bit, we're all going to be mandated to follow a particular framework under the new National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. If we don't meet those mandatory requirements, we can't conduct clinical trials. We have to work together.
But it does seem that BPHP could call for this and then coordinate the right group just to as a committee that would then report, what their findings are with the right people around the table.
Absolutely.
And presumably do that with the minister of health, right? So that does seem like something.
So Barbara, I'd just like to understand in your jurisdiction, what happens when you've got an overarching agreement like that, and yet project-specific issues come up around IP and partners pull back from what they've signed? How do you manage that? Because that's a very real problem for the BDHP agreement.
So, okay, well, I'm never going to understand all the context between the state and federal and everything else, but I'll try. So, so my own feeling is that we overvalue the IP in the clinical trial. I mean, most of the people that go into a clinical trial, the IP is there, based on the molecular characteristics of whatever is being tested, or the algorithm or whatever, and it's very hard to show something in a clinical trial that is truly new. I mean, you could probably disagree, but it's truly new and worthy of itself of an IP. We spent hours and days, weeks, months learning about this, and if you did an analysis of all of the IP pieces for all of the clinical trials, I would be shocked if there's any real money in it, compared to the time that we all spend negotiating this about what the split is going to be. So I think those are sort of basically also a sort of fictional concern. I know that everybody's worried, and everybody thinks they're going to get rich because they do a phase 2 or a phase 1 or whatever. What they're doing it on is actually already decided. So that's my answer to it. And just to say, we used to, at the Brigham and Women's, when I was senior vice president for research and ran this stuff, we had just the same sets of discussions. And I basically said, look, if it's an industry-sponsored trial, we don't even want you to address IP. It is off the table. We are not worrying about it. It is not our IP. If you do something new with that, then you negotiate it before you can get to a trial.
So in response to that, and also Carolyn's earlier comment that health is often perceived as the problem, a live example for us is a new therapy industry partner with our patients, but a research institute as well, and that's often where the complexity comes. It's the multi-institutional agreements that are really hard to negotiate, and there's significant delays in that whole process.
But if you supply patients, what is your intellectual contribution to the invention? I'm just saying, I mean, there's patent law on this. You've got to have patent law in Australia, So I don't understand that. Now, it's one thing if you take drug X and somebody else's drug Y, and you put it together and you get a new treatment for Z. See how quickly I got? So that is worth pausing. The number of times that these things come up, I think, is trivially, it's just small.
So I think we've identified somewhere here where the investigator has a responsibility to actually say, I'm going to start this clinical trial. We have already registered, we've already applied for the intellectual property, the patents are already registered, and actually make a clear statement as to any expectations in relation to IP that's actually going to come out of that trial. And I think that means that if it does, we have basically signed off that there's nothing going to come out of it, okay? And if that helps us to actually fast track, if it helps us to fast track the process, then I think that's a responsibility that we actually need to take on board.
Yeah.
So there's two broad things. We can have some local solutions, and that can be Sandro's navigator, could be a PDHP lawyer to actually navigate the complex agreements. But really we need national progress, and we've seen that with the single ethics submission. It's been very successful. And so that has to come through the federal and state governments and local governments, because it's the state governments that run our hospitals. The federal government's got some input into universities because they provide their funding. And so that's the level that I think we have to influence. We have got the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, which is a group tasked with trying to deal with some of those issues. And we should have input into that body to try and influence the process. But I think trying to just get a solution that just works for Brisbane is not going to cut it. We need an Australian-wide solution, cross-jurisdictional. That's difficult, but we know through HOMA it can be done, and that's where we have to put our efforts.
I couldn't agree more, and in fact, John and I have talked with the Queensland Health operatives, that's HERO, about this repeatedly, and what I'd encourage all of you is, if you're meeting with senior management within Queensland Health and in HERO, is to keep making this point, because they don't get it yet, because they're not directly affected. I think whilst we can work through our own channels, through NHMRC, MOFF and the like, and we are influential in those spaces, we need Queensland government to actually want this to happen and to lead this nationally. We need to all advocate.
So just to say, there would be nothing wrong, I guess, in getting all the CEOs or research teams to call together publicly for an editorial on what is necessary and how important this is, and in advance meet with Minister Hunt or somebody who really understands trials. I mean, I don't know if you are at ACTA, were you at ACTA? The Australian Clinical Trials Alliance meeting just occurred last week, and he really understands. I mean, he's polished, but he really understands clinical trials and the value of clinical research. He'd be most receptive to him.
Greg Hunt's a good subject, but they all have a lifespan of about 2 or 3 years before
Yeah. So let's just talk about that for a second. This is where we are. We can always find problems, but the glass has to keep getting filled, and you have to keep pushing. And if all of the leaders of the institutions come up with a solution, are they going to really mind that? It's going to save money. It's going to save all this administrative time from all these people that can then do research. Are they going to say, oh, this is a terrible idea, we don't have our own form? They may not say, here's $25 million. We're not talking about something that's politically sensitive.
I actually think that we would get a positive response, because if you actually have a look at the Medical Research Futures Fund, the $20 billion, a very significant proportion of that is being allocated to clinical trials. And there's odds on that the Minister for Health probably doesn't understand in detail the issues that we're all facing. I mean, when I last had dinner with him and I pointed out that there was a national shortage of health economists, he had no idea.
So if people don't actually tell him there's a problem, he's not going to know about it.
Right.
On a practical micro level, how do we get approval for electronic signatures? How do we use technology a little bit better? Sandra, getting all those signatures, using something like DocuSign, sending it out, getting it all back within a day. People with mobile phones, they can sign things off. Who makes that decision?
Governance, I think.
Well, not governance.
No,
Governance, it's an
executive
institutional
director.
policy usually.
Executive director.
It's an institutional policy usually, and it's also now in ICH GCP E6 R2 that you can do it, so you just have to change the institutional policy. You do have to make sure that there's, you know, an audit trail. So DocuSign is fine, but a lot of the, okay, I sign is not.
I think, sorry to interrupt, I think the biggest thing is that there's an awareness of exactly what is being signed,
Yeah.
and the responsibilities and delegations that go with that signature. Whether it's DocuSign, electronic signatures, wedding signatures, an email, a letter of support, a signature on a PDF, all of those are acceptable. They're all auditable trails of documentation. You can go back to the PI, the head of department, finance manager, whoever signature it is, to say that, yep, they've looked at the information in front of them, they've provided their approval under the delegation responsibility. It's not how you do it, it's got to go back to why you're doing it.
But is that policy at all the institutions that
We
it's
accept
acceptable?
any form of signatures, whether it be an email, a letter of support,
Yeah.
a
And
PDF,
are you speaking to everyone here?
for Metro South, but
I see.
University Metro is the same.
All right, so
Yeah.
solved. We did something today. Yeah.
That's the issue is not the signature, it's the fact that you need to get, if you've got multi departments within one hospital,
Right.
you've got to get so many signatures. That whole trail, and, you know, as a clinic, you know, and it just keeps bouncing back. You know.
So we might pause there for a while, because I'll tell you, we don't do any of that in America. We don't have
can I
the...
work with you?
Yeah, you know, what's the point of having, let me, you're next. What's the point of having departmental signatures? Is it financial? Is it to make sure that the people are trained? Is it, you know, evaluating in-kind support? And if it's in-kind support, is it better to be giving more support so that you're showing how much research you're doing? Or is it less support so you show how little money you're losing by doing something in kind? I mean, I don't understand why the departments sign off. You're gonna lose money on certain trials, and it's invisible money. So why does that happen?
Can I just add something that's also quite silly? That I have to provide my own department with the degree of in-kind support that I'm providing for my own trial to my own department, which is part of my own job description. So it makes absolutely no sense why I'm writing on my in-kind support. And you make up a nebulous amount, like you say, half an hour. You know, those things, if you do lots of them and you've got multiple applications, start to grind because you go, I'm not sure why I'm actually doing this for the trial. It has no bearing on the input.
Or
And
at your
it's
annual
part of my
review,
job
will they
description.
say, you know, you haven't done your job because you're only spending half an hour a week on it.
I think it comes down to resource impact. If you've got a massive department, and one department springs to mind in particular, that has over 200 clinical trials, let alone all the other clinical research that's happening, there's an impact within a patient department when patients are seen on the back of their clinical visits. They're then seen for research purposes within the department, taking up the share. So in terms of identifying resource impact, my understanding is that's why the head of department needs to sign off. But it's only the head of the initiating department. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm more than happy to broaden the view on that and take other people's considerations into that. The fact that that's where that policy is kind of coming.
You need the signature of the head and the finance manager.
Of each department
Of each
that's
department.
involved.
No, only of the, for Metro South, it's just for the initiating department. So if you're doing it within the services, it's just you not.
Okay.
You don't need to be
The time flew. So, let me just say, I think getting advice from other industries locally, as in nationally Australia or elsewhere, is a good idea. But, in the end, people have to be comfortable that you're putting people at risk, not a wattage at, and there's going to be particular sensitivities on that. I do think that this idea of a national agreement for clinical research where the risk is low is a very good idea, and there are lots of models out there. I do think that all of these should be risk-based, and indeed, if the governance sign-off is only based, let's say, for that hospital on 3 pieces, why are you getting sign-off on anything else? Basically the IRB, if it's under 5 pregnant women or something, I forget the third, those are the ones that should get referred. Everything else should go through. Those are sort of easy things. Getting forms and pieces together are easy. Figuring out why you're getting sign-off from all these folks, what do they use that information for, and your idea of collecting it, having a dashboard about this kind of thing is a good idea. I think that beyond all of that, there has to be a sense that at least in Queensland, you're going to work together to make the system better, because half of you are associated in more than one institution, and you've got to comply with more than one set of expectations. And research is done multi-institutionally. So I think that drive, which has to, in some ways, come from the top, is a really important cohesive element amongst the leadership. And the idea that there's financial competition or referral competition or whatever by having a sort of alliance, I reject. I can tell you that in every experience of mine, you build that and you get more. You don't get less. And you bring in more trials and you bring in more referrals because it's known as a place of excellence. So I just think that, it's not a question of how we cut the pie, it's a question of building a larger pie. But I do think that having transparency around the financials is well worthwhile. I see no reason why we keep it sort of privileged, and you can make up, I know that everybody doesn't want to say how much their x-rays cost, and whether they cost more for commercial sponsors than for general sponsors. There are lots of ways of addressing that so that everybody's treated fairly. But I think this has been incredibly informative, and it's 9:30, and I want to thank the panel again for giving us